So hello to everyone, good morning and good afternoon, dear colleagues, members of the academic community, dear friends, dear Louis Gordon. Yes, I can see. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to welcome and introduce you, Louis Gordon, to this conference and also to your lecture. I ask myself if I really do have to introduce you here, because Louis Gordon is a professor for philosophy at the University of Connecticut, so many of you might know him very well. He's also a visiting professor at Toulouse University in France. I think you are collaborating, I think, with Jean-Christophe Godard, who is now recently became a partner of University of Tübingen too. And you were also a visiting professor, Nelson Mandela visiting professor in political and international studies at Rhodes University in South Africa. He's the founder of the only Center for Afro-Jewish Studies that exists in the world, and founded the Second Chance program at the Lehman High School in the Bronx, New York. His main research and teaching areas are Africana philosophy, philosophy of existence, Black existentialism, phenomenology, philosophy of science, social, political, and public philosophy, philosophy of education, aesthetics and philosophy in film, literature, and music, philosophy of culture, philosophy of psychiatry, philosophical psychoanalysis. Is there any important tradition in philosophy which is not represented in this portfolio? But impressing is not only the historical, broad and deep knowledge, it is impressing, but the convincing gesture of his thinking art that he practices and teaches. Thinking art is a form of thinking that is deeply rooted in or connected to the basic human need for pictures, music, rhythms, and poetry, and so forms a very colorful and concise ensemble with anthropology, sociology, art, and history. The philosophical ancestors like Husserl, Aristoteles, and Fanon are not his objects of study, but play their role more like partners and starting points for his own and innovative philosophy. Gordon's philosophical writings about racism are one of the most important works on that matter, and coined some definitions like the one of a Euromodernism and a new understanding of the other. Racism does not, as many think, address and define the other, because in philosophy, the other is still me, but denies the majority of humanity the right to be the other, the right to be in the same room. So now I'm going to read you the more than 22 pages of publications of Louis Gordon. No, I'm not going to do that. I apologize for not doing that, because many of you have read Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, or Fanon and the Crisis of European Men, and many other publications. So please, in order to give the lecture and discussion more time, I skip that. And Louis Gordon, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorothy Kimmich. I also would like to extend Danke, thank you to Sebastian Wittgenstein and the fellow organizers, and to Ann Stoller and Lawrence Hirschfeld. I'm at their home right now because I'm in New York City to attend a screening of a documentary on Fanon, in which I play a major role. But I cannot open without also extending my appreciation, joy, thanks to Boaventura de Souza for your presentation, and also just to Boa period, because he, and along with Mabocho More, who's also here, I consider family. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Lynn Terrell, Dan Wiener, Avino and Pat, Sarah Willen, Sharon Hertel, and Kafinga for joining us, and additionally, Isabel Sluka, who studied contemporary Africana philosophy with me, and Yijing Jenny Yang in Spain, who I'm delighted to see here. She's doing extraordinary work in peace studies and a variety of other areas related to these issues. So I begin with saying, Hotep, Shalom, Assalamu alaikum. It's striking that greetings have taken a point of saying peace. I come in peace. That tells you that something has happened to humanity. Why would people even come to that kind of greeting? But as we know, and something connected to what Boa was just pointing out, not everybody greets each other in the same way, because we have organizing experiences with a multitude of concepts. You could say, for instance, Dumela, or you could say, for instance, Vanaka, which is from Tamil, or you could say it like Sawubona among the Zulu, which means I see you. And when you think about when you say I see you, related quite a bit to what Dorothy Kilish just said, this is not saying you're the other as an enemy. In a way, if one is in a hostile circumstance, I see you is also a welcoming moment of an ally, of being in it together, of joining each other. So I see you. Now, the Euromodern world faces a crisis of justification. And a lot of what I'm talking about, I explore some of these ideas in my recent book, Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization. But here I offer an outline of some concepts I hope would be useful for many of you. This crisis of justification, of course, comes from a rather pernicious history. And this is because the history of the Euromodern world, right, is also marked by the scope of its colonial practices. And the colonial practices are basically the disempowerment of the global majority. We often forget today that the majority of humanity, although in colonial terms, have an element of cultural Europeanism. The majority of humanity is not European and definitely not white. And we also forget that not all Europeans are white. And so I'd like to just put that on the table. But as we know, there are moments of reprieve. We are, for instance, right now in a fortunate moment in some countries, such as the United States, from which I'm speaking, and some parts of and also in the UK, of a reprieve from the encroaching fascism. And in some cases, it's not even encroaching. The fascism is already here. Now, I say reprieve because the threat, as we know, hasn't disappeared. As of this presentation, there are forces being rallied beyond conventional forces of war to develop techniques attested to since 2001, rooted in what's called lawfare. And I'm going to come back to lawfare, but I'm just going to continue through so we'll have enough time to speak. For discussion. Now, this phenomenon of encroaching fascism and of rallying the forces of using legislation to undermine the potential of democracy, right? All of these challenge the context of this meeting. Because as we know, we say human rights and democracy. What we're finding is that we're also living in a period of a kind of perverse republicanism. And I don't mean in terms of the Republican Party of the United States, although they are really particularly guilty of this, but a form of reverse republicanism in which the rule of law is asserted while the spirit through which law gains legitimacy is undermined, is imperiled. And if we go beyond the question of law, we're also dealing with the age-old problem of legitimacy and who brings that normative ideal to governing apparatuses. There was once, for instance, if we think about antiquity, the divine or the gods. But as they died, the realization of the people, and I put square quotes, but I am not anti the idea of the people, but the people followed. And as we know with democracy, we're talking about the demos, the people, that's a crucial element. in this kind of analysis. Now, for too many, the very idea of the people is too much to bear. There's a form of misanthropy that underlines one side of Euromodernity. Now, when I say Euromodern and I say Euromodernity here, I do not at all mean to treat it in totalitarian closed terms. As I speak, we know there was always a dialectical opposition. But within that framework, for those who were misanthropic, humanity, the idea of people, the people, was a source of great trepidation. It's related to my point about I come in peace, because the presupposition is to see the other, or to see another human being, is to encounter a conflict or war. This is particularly stark in the Hobbesian framework that has dominated not only the Anglo element of Euromodern thought, but also it's the underlying logic of neoliberalism and neoconservatism, both of which play a crucial role in the fascism of the moment. One of the things in that way of looking at people is to contrast people with nature, and Bo was just talking about this, but it's not exactly nature. It's actually the imposition of a form of inert, material, dead notion of nature that hides, through the spirit of seriousness in existential terms, the collective responsibility of life on this planet. Now, a human right, by definition, applies to all human beings. That should be pretty obvious, right? And I should like to add, in concert with Boa, that I tend to write more about dignity and freedom. But there is this importance about talking about human rights, as we know, particularly if we look at Black political thought. If you look at the ideas of El-Malik al-Shabazz, known as Malcolm X, he was very critical of the civil rights movement in the United States because he argued there needed to be a human rights movement. And before him, there were individuals such as William Patterson, W.B. Du Bois, as we know, who brought the United States of America on charges of genocide against indigenous peoples and Black peoples, and they brought up those charges before the United Nations. But as I continue, the thing that we should bear in mind is that we're talking about human rights right now precisely because there are violations of the humanity and the rights of people. And these violations, which are linked to the way I talked about Euromodern colonialism, are constitutive of what we could call oppression. Now, again, I'm going to use more summary conceptual terms because we have limited time. So oppression fundamentally involves the disempowerment of groups of human beings, okay? And there are those who can extend it beyond human beings, but in the context, since we're talking about human rights, this discussion will be human focused. Now, the disempowering of human beings, right, leads to a structure in which there's an enterprise that requires the expansion of power for some human beings at the expense of others. This structure also applies to the epistemic and normative colonization of human rights talk. We often forget that human rights talk itself could also, and Boa hinted at this, is also part of the logic of this crisis and this problem of domination, to which I'll return. But I could pose a question here. If human rights pertains to all, but the conditions of their implementation are in the hands of the few, how can this be achieved without this disempowerment of the rest of humanity's political capacity to contribute to the practices of the very legitimacy avowed? So already embedded in the very assertion of the human right is a democratic challenge. Now, the denials of democratic participation takes the form of imposed invisibilities. And if you're curious about elaboration of some of these, I talk about them in Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, and also in another book that's forthcoming called Fear of Black Consciousness. But right now, I'm just going to list them. So if you think about imposed invisibilities, and all imposed invisibilities are connected to practices of disempowerment. There are racial imposed invisibilities, and racial imposed invisibilities connect to the very idea of illicit appearance. In other words, the idea that you're violating the norms of reality, of decency, of public life simply by appearing. And because of this, and this is one of the features of racial invisibility, and it's interestingly connected to the work of Ann Stoler, at whose home I'm staying right now, this leads to an obsession with quantity. If one is talking about racialized invisibilities, the obsession is how many of those people are there. And this, in a very interesting way, links to Wilfried Hinch's keynote, as we know, because he was talking about statistical issues involved in certain forms of human rights erasure. But alongside the racial, there's the indigenous. And the indigenous one, again, just to be quick about it, tends to be linked to temporality, because the imposition of primitiveness on indigenous peoples ultimately means belonging is a feature of the past. In effect, that creates, as a very construction of the production of the Euro-modern world, the idea of a future without such people, which means then the very question of their invisibility is linked to the very notion of futurity. And then there's the engendered form of invisibility. Now, it's not that it's exclusively to women. This happens with racialized indigenous frameworks. But the history of what we call Western humanity is replete, and it's also parts of Northeast Asian humanity, replete with the idea that women are not to have voices. If you look at a lot of women's literature over more than 2 millennia, you will find in these parts of the world the word voice repeated. And again, many of you right now could even name easily 5 to 7, 10 books with the word voice written by women. And many of you cannot name a book written by a man with that term. Now, this becomes crucial because, as we know, if we're talking about political life, as we know, depends on speech. And so if you don't have a voice, you have a structural limitation in how you can actually be part of the polity. And we could mention the fact that that women can say speak, but it's more complex because voice requires also being heard. And the logic of listening as part of the empowerment of a people, the point of listening as part of democratic practices, the point of listening as part of political life, this becomes a crucial element as we address these forms of invisibility. And then the other one, and some of that was hinted at in Boa's talk, is epistemic invisibility. And the imposition of the illegitimacy of the knowledge you offer has a profound impact because part of participating in the political sphere is actually to be able to offer a position that is listened to, and thus in the process constitutive of doxa, if we look at it in the ancient form of public opinion, or episteme, if we look at it in the question of what is to be done. And all of these lead to forms of paradoxes. There could be paradoxes, for instance, as we see right now, where there could be the discourse of race that's in the public sphere. We could have Juneteenth in the United States as an example, but at the same time, there is a form of romanticization, a form of valorization of excluded peoples that paradoxically make them hypervisible in ways that actually negate or denude them of their humanity and thus affects participation. Now, these issues lead to very important forms of critique. One critique is of liberal political theory. And the reason it's very important to offer a critique of liberal political theory is because so much of human rights discourse is locked in to liberal political theoretical analysis, liberal forms of political philosophy. But there's a problem when you analyze much of liberal political theory and liberal political philosophy. And the problem is that they're often premised upon a naive presupposition of the application of moral theory to politia. In other words, the presumption that it's simply about getting it right morally and applying it. Now, this becomes particularly problematic because ultimately it leads in its logic to the supervenience of governing over politics. Politics tends to be the generative activity. Governing tends to be the rules and regulations by which that activity is even permitted to take place. And as we see today, when we think about what is going on with what I brought up earlier with lawfare, we see in the fetishizing of law linked to the presupposition of the moral underpinnings of law, the use of law as a way of conducting war by other means. Although lawfare was coined by Major General Charles Dunlap in 2001, the analysis of lawfare actually precedes it in a lot of Black and global Southern writings. You could see it in writings by W.B. Du Bois. You could see it in writings by Steve Bantu Biko in South Africa, and many, many more, okay? And part of this is to remember that part of the arsenal of dehumanization of Black people was done by legal means. And the contemporary effort, particularly in the United States or in countries like Brazil, or if you look at what's going on in Hungary or India, one of the things we know is that practices of disenfranchisement can be done through practices of legalization. And just to give you a sense of it, the Institute for Lawfare simply defines lawfare in this way. Lawfare is the misuse and abuse of law for political and military ends. This is a quote. Lawfare is a powerful weapon for fighting political enemies, combining apparently legal actions and widespread media coverage. The idea is to embarrass the enemy to the point where they become extremely vulnerable to the baseless accusations. Once weakened, they lose popular support and any power of reaction. And a good example is the current drummed up hype about critical race theory that's happening over not only in the United States, but it's happening in countries of Europe, et cetera. And their deliberate distortion and misrepresentation of these issues, because ultimately, if you think about the very logic of disempowerment, if you think about the very logic of how colonialism works, the whole logic is ultimately a form of narcissistic rage against reality. If, in other words, the whole struggle for liberation, for transformation, for the rights of all is legitimate, it ultimately depends on truth, which means then that the practices of disempowerment are fundamentally, quotidianly premised upon lies. So we already see why truth is in jeopardy in our age. And underlying this, if we come to the level of critique, we could actually raise the question of colonization at the epistemological levels, even at the level of human rights talk, and the very practices of how certain models of political theory are rallied for that talk. And again, it'll take me too much time to get into the details here, but I'll just give you some elements. I've already hinted at one. One element of the colonization of human rights talk, and by extension, political theorizing, is the presupposition that the racial and ethnic origins of human rights or certain forms of normative talk must be Western or European. And this relies upon the misrepresentation of history, it relies upon the misrepresentation of people, but it also relies on a form of epistemological racism. And again, I don't have time to get into the detail here, but people, for instance, who study African languages know very well that they are conceptions of personhood that are linked into the rights of communities that were not introduced by Europeans, but was actually interfered with and undermined by colonial practices. The second is the coloniality of its norms. And there are certain forms of norms of presentation that even in the practice of how to talk about these phenomena may wed them into the logic of agonality or war. And again, we could talk about that some other time, or you could look into some other texts. The other one, already hinted at in some of the lectures of the previous discussions, is the market commodification of thought. In other words, when human rights talk becomes commodified by market forces, it limits upon that talk the extent to which it can be properly critical of market forces. And we know this because this is the technique used in the formation of neoliberalism from Hayek and many others, even some of what has happened in certain moves that took place in, for instance, the Frankfurt brand of critical theory in the post and very Jewish secular period into a more Protestant and almost neo-Kantian period that ultimately sells its marketability through the moralization that undermines its political efficacy. Another kind is disciplinary decadence, and disciplinary decadence is when we attempt through the ontologizing or deifying of our disciplines to close them off from the communicative practices through which the disciplines can be held accountable. A good example of this is even the way we could think, say, of liberal analytical political thought. A lot of us today, when we use someone like John Rawls, is completely unaware that 30 years before John Rawls, there was Charles Houston. And Charles Houston was a Black jurist who had actually developed the very same theory of justice of John Rawls. But part of the colonization of ideas is to make it legitimate if it's presented in the form of ideas from an Anglo-white man. And the differences between Charles Houston and Rawls are rather striking. I can't get into details here, but one difference is on the difference principle. And that is where John Rawls argues that you can ultimately permit certain inequalities if they can benefit the least advantaged. But he argues in relation to the first principle that the libertarian principle must prevail. In Charles Houston said that was complete bonkers before Rawls even popped up. Because his point was, what's the point of having liberties that you cannot materially act on? So for Charles Houston, as an example, the second principle, right, of justice was actually more linked for the condition of possibility of having human rights at all. Now, a lot of what I'm saying here raises the question, if I'm going to give a critique of moral application, the question of political responsibility. And political responsibility, and again, that's a whole lecture in itself, but the short version of this is a lot of my ideas on political responsibility moves through understandings not only in global Southern thought with concepts like Ubuntu, but also through Northern European thought, such as ideas from Karl Jaspers, particularly in his critique, and when he talked in his work, Schuldfrage, or if we talk about the responsibility or guilt question. But Iris Young and many others have taken on political responsibility. For our purposes right now, I just want to bring up a basic point, which is that under neoliberalism and neoconservatism, which prioritizes moral responsibility over political responsibility, there is a form of valorization of privatization that individualizes power. And in an age of the privatization of power, particularly made global, and particularly in the domination of global understandings, this leads to a form of disempowerment, not only in the form like lawfare, but also in the form of end of history economic analyses through which we fail to understand the extent to which public obligations, globally defined, would require the idea of democracy as a human right. To put differently, as we radicalize global privatization, we actually disempower people in the globe, the majority of people in the globe's capacity to act on the interests of the welfare of this planet and life itself. So if we're going to talk about the globalization of the public dimensions of political responsibility, which means that we have to negate the commodification and the radicalization of privatization, there are some obvious questions that pop up. And to understand these questions that pop up, we need, of course, to understand the distinction between the way we talk about the right and the left. And again, that will take a long time, but the short version is the movements to the right tend to prioritize, tend to make a supervening law over politics, because politics depends on the contingency of action. If you move to the right sufficiently, they tend to cherry pick and to build a form of conservatism in which, from Hobbes all the way through to the present, dissent, difference, and all of those are maligned precisely because they see themselves as the enemy of order. So this is why neoliberalism and neoconservatism tend to slide into fascism. And we're living in an age right now in which there is a concerted and a very real anti-democracy. And it's no accident that this movement of anti-democracy is connected to the very processes of an effort to empower those who are disempowered by colonialism, racism, and patriarchy. So if we begin to understand this, we begin to understand that a lot of leftism, there are different types of leftism, but the crucial leftism I'm interested in here is the leftism that is based upon the understanding of political action as a commitment that is premised upon understanding that we don't have an outcome before performance. There are forms of leftism that want to have predictability and outcome before performance, but those forms of leftism inevitably slide into the right because they're ultimately profoundly anti-political. So the one I'm arguing for are those that are patently political, because ultimately, if one thinks about democracy, the question of democracy is going to be linked into understanding power and contingency in ways that also bring along political responsibility. Now, when I say power, I have to stress that I'm using power in a way that's diametrically opposed to the Hobbesian model of power, because the Hobbesian model reduces power to coercion, almost exclusively coercive models. But what's often lost in the hullabaloo is the extent to which power is quite simply the ability to make things happen with access to conditions of doing so. And this is why Charles Houston's ideas are very important, because ultimately, if we're transforming the lives of the disempowered, their empowerment requires access to the conditions of the ability to change the world. Now, this means, and this is where I conclude, we have right now an epic struggle between different models of globalism, privatized globalism and public globalism. It's inevitable if we think of public globalism that many models, nation-state models, state-state models, a lot of those models cannot work well for the kind of crises we have today. Benjamin Barber was excellent at this when he said, in a nutshell, nature doesn't negotiate. And what he means by this is that if we're dealing from ecological crises all the way through to the question of the mobility of labor, all the way through to the question of how our tiny little blue dot of a planet can function, it's pretty clear that we need to be rethinking something that fits 21st into 22nd century instead of being locked into these stupid debates about which past century we're going to use as legitimate. If you look at a lot of contemporary global debates, it's about whether you want to be like the 20th century, the 19th, the 18th, the 17th, et cetera. But what we forget is that we're dealing with the unprecedented. 21st century problems require 21st century responses, but 21st century responses are also responses linked into a form of antipathy to the question of having political solutions to political problems. So if we think about political solutions, it means we have to rethink democracy, because the globalization of access means also the globalization of democracy, but democracy not understood as a top-down model, but as a bottom-up one. And this may mean a form of global federalism in which we rethink organizations of power. We even rethink notions of executive branches and all of these, because we now have to deal with the global communicative exemplification of what it means to have a voice. And some may object that there may be countries in which their normative ideals are monarchies or dictatorships or strong men and all of that stuff. But you see, the problem with those is that already, if we're in our very structure communicating with each other and dealing with the question of how we're going to learn as a species to deal with the conditions of efficacy of empowerment, it already means that those are models that already would actually have to make some appeal to democracy for their legitimacy. So in effect then, the very struggle for liberation is already at its heart a struggle for democracy as a human right. And that's why it's no accident that the forces of fascism, the forces of totalitarian misanthropy are making not only lawfare, but disenfranchisement a core element of their practice. So to conclude, democracy is an exemplification of having a voice. Thank you.